Hello, everyone. Welcome. I'm Jennifer Nyman. I'm a principal at Geosyntech Consultants and will be facilitating today's event. The webinar today focuses on a very timely topic, DoD-funded research on addressing PFAS impacts from AFFF usage and identifying, comparing, and ultimately approving alternative firefighting agents to AFFF. First, today, Dr. Mark Aziz of Duke University will present on the performance and costs of PFAS destruction using a continuous pilot supercritical water oxidation system. Mark's presentation will be followed by a question and answer session. Then Dr. Joel Tickner of the University of Massachusetts Lowell will discuss challenges and opportunities for developing approaches used to identify, compare, and adopt AFFF alternatives. His presentation will also be followed by a question and answer session. We'll conclude the webinar today with a question and answer session featuring both of today's speakers. The next couple slides provide some instructions for your webinar experience. If you haven't done so, you can download Zoom at the link shown here. If you cannot download Zoom, you can view the slides using a compatible internet browser like Firefox, IE, or Edge by creating a free Zoom account. If your screen freezes, just a reminder that you can key Control with F5 to perform a refresh. If you have audio issues and you're accessing audio through your computer, you can click the arrow next to the Join Audio button and select Test Speaker and Microphone to follow the prompts as they appear on your screen. And then if you continue to experience difficulties, we suggest calling into the conference line shown here. For difficulties, you can also submit a comment using the chat box, but please use that chat box just for comments related to technical difficulties. We're going to use the Q&A box on Zoom for questions for the speakers. In case of continued technical difficulties, you can download the PDF of the slides from the webinar webpage on the SERDP and ESTCP webpage, and then you can call into the conference call line provided to you. We'll also be live streaming the webinar on the YouTube channel link shown here. Today's broadcast is listen only. We would like you to submit questions, however. Submit those questions using the Q&A box that is on the Zoom screen. You don't have to wait until the Q&A sessions to submit your questions. In fact, it'd be great if you could type them in advance of that session. And then when you submit a question, we also ask that you add your organizational name at the end of the question so that we can identify you. With that, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Andrea Leeson, who is the Deputy Director of SERDP and ESTCP, as well as the Program Manager for the Environmental Restoration Program area. She has been with SERDP and ESTCP since 2001. And prior to that, she was a research leader at the Battelle Memorial Institute, where she conducted research on in-situ bioremediation and the design and implementation of innovative treatment technologies. Andrea received her doctoral degree in environmental engineering from the Johns Hopkins University. Andrea, please proceed.
Thank you so much, Jennifer, and thank you to everyone who's joined our webinar today as well. I just wanted to take a few minutes to talk about who we are, we being SERDP and ESTCP, before we jump into the presentations that I'm sure you're anxious to see. First, we have our two companion programs, SERDP, which is the Strategic Environmental Research and Development Program. This is really our traditional R&D program. It's a partnership between the DoD, Department of Energy, and the EPA. And our goal really is to take our fundamental research and use it to impact real-world environmental management. It all is geared towards addressing these real-world issues that we have in managing environmental issues at our installations. ESTCP is the Environmental Security Technology Certification Program, and this is our demonstration and validation program, where we take the knowledge or the technologies that have come out of SERDP or other research programs, and we demonstrate them in the field so that we can really get good cost and performance data at a pilot scale level that will help us when we want to go to full scale. And the goal is to accelerate commercialization of specific technologies, or at least a broader adoption of those technologies that we validated. We have a number of environmental drivers that guide the sort of research and demonstrations that we fund, and these are very broad issues that are applicable to many DoD installations, everything from maritime sustainability to climate issues, noise, UXO, and munitions constituents. We also are looking at reducing current and future liability. So that can take the form of pollution prevention, where we're looking to eliminate hazardous chemicals of concern or materials or processes at our installations. And then also we're looking at impacts from past practices. That could be impacts to our groundwater, soils, or sediments, and it includes some of our legacy chemicals of concern that we're very familiar with, as well as some of the emerging chemicals of concern. And both of our presentations today will fall under this issue of looking at reducing current and future liability. We have a number of focus areas, and you can see from this list, they're pretty broad. Everything from the top of the list at PFAS and AFFF, down to electrical infrastructure and planning. And today our presentations will be addressing PFAS and AFFF. And so I presented here our flow chart of these projects and what we've been doing on these issues since 2011. At the bottom of this page, there's a link that will take you to the website that has this flow chart on it. And we've also put it in the chat. And you'll see this chart. It is interactive, and you can click on the various boxes that will show you the different projects that have been selected under all these different topic areas. And there is just a wealth of information about PFAS and AFFF available here, and I encourage you to take a look if this is of interest to you. The bedrock of our program is really on the technology transition, and that is very critical to getting out the word on these successful technologies that we're funding under SERDP and ESTCP. We do this in a number of ways. If you go to our website, you'll be able to find different videos, guidances, manuals on how to do things. We have an EnviroWiki that gives summaries of various different types of technologies. And then key to all of it are these webinars that we're watching today. Listed here are a number of upcoming webinars. Part 2 of this series that we're starting today will be up in a couple of weeks, where we're looking at additional technologies, both for treatment as well as developing PFAS-free firefighting formulations. But as you can see from the list, there are a number of different topics as well. For upcoming webinars, you can go to this link, and what you will find there are any of the upcoming webinars that I just listed. You can register for them there. We also archive all webinars so that you can go back to that site and view other webinars that you may have missed and get that information as well. I'd also like to mention that we have our annual SERDP and ESTCP symposium coming up November 29th through December 2nd. It is an excellent opportunity to see a little bit of everything we fund. All of our active investigators are presenting at the meeting, either through poster presentations, short courses, or the technical sessions themselves. So I hope you can join us. At this point, I'd like to turn it back to Jennifer to introduce our next speaker. Jennifer.
Thanks, Andrea. Now my pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Mark Aziz. He is a professor in the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering at Duke University. Mark serves as the Associate Editor for Biotechnology and Bioengineering and is the Director of Duke's Energy Engineering Program. His research interests are in novel reactors and sustainable processes for air, water, and waste treatment. He received bachelor's and master's degrees in chemical engineering from the Swiss Federal Institutes of Technology and a doctoral degree in technical sciences with a major focus on environmental biotechnology, also from the Swiss Federal Institutes of Technology. Mark, please proceed.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to have an opportunity to talk. Thank you for the introduction as well. Indeed, I'm a professor at Duke University. I also need to disclose that I'm a co-founder and head of technology for commercial entity for water, which is commercializing this technology that I'm going to be talking about today, the supercritical water oxidation, or we say SCWO. The This is the outline of my presentation. I'll go over project objectives, talk a little bit about background, explaining what supercritical water oxidation is, and describe our pilot system that is at Duke, and then go over the results, show you some detailed results, in particular closing the fluorine balance, and exploring other, back to that, and and wrapping it up with lessons learned, as well as including treatment costs. So, technical objectives for our ESTCP project is to show the technical feasibility of using SCWO for destruction of PFAS. And we're focusing primarily on rinsates, but as I will show you some results as well on other matrices. And then determine and optimize treatment costs, have a determination of what it means at scale, and also prepare for technology transition. So the demonstration elements include both treatability with a pilot, as is shown here on the screen. This is the our pilot SCWO system, doing some techno-analysis studies for understanding what the costs are, and technology transition activities. A lot of these are going through 374 water, but also we have an Enviro wiki, and have been very open about publishing and presenting. So what is supercritical water oxidation, and what is supercritical water? We're all used to think that water comes in three forms: liquid, solid, and gas. It turns out that if you heat and compress water to the extreme, and I'm talking here above 374 degrees C or 705 degrees Fahrenheit, and roughly 220 times atmospheric pressure, water becomes supercritical. What does it mean? Well, it is neither a gas nor a liquid, but it borrows very interesting properties of both. It's semi-dense, has a specific gravity of roughly 0.1 to 0.3, and is extremely rapid heat and mass transfer water. But also it is a very reactive medium. And what that means is that if you inject oxygen or another oxidant in supercritical water, the organics are going to be reacting really, really quickly in a matter of seconds, and be oxidized to their most stable elements. So the attributes of supercritical water are listed to the left here. Get very fast reactions. We mineralize all contaminants to CO2 and stable elements, and we call it waste agnostic. That means we can treat all kinds of co-pollutants, solvents, surfactants, chlorinated co-pollutants that come with the waste are all going to be oxidized without the formation of byproducts. We're not producing a secondary waste stream. And we can treat both liquids and we can treat slurries. And the process is scalable, meaning that we can imagine small systems as well as very large systems. So specific to PFAS, we've discovered that supercritical water oxidation can destroy PFAS, and the overall reaction looks like something at the bottom, like is shown at the bottom. Is that you take PFAS in supercritical conditions in water, and we're using air as the source of oxygen, as the oxidant. Air is a lot safer. And at supercritical conditions, what happens is that we break down the PFAS molecules to result in CO2, mineralizing the PFAS to fluoride. And if there is hardness or presence of calcium, we see a lot of calcium fluoride precipitation. We get the heat of reactions because those oxidation reactions are exothermic reactions and production of water. So that's the overall reaction that here I'm showing some pictures and some attributes of the pilot system that we have at Duke University. It's in a 20-foot container. It was originally designed and built with funding from the Gates Foundation. Starting in 2013, the Gates Foundation funded a program in my lab to look at supercritical water oxidation for the destruction of fecal sludge in developing countries. And then much later, we realized it can destroy all kinds of pollutants, and this is when we did some trials with PFAS, and then later got ESTCP. It is a continuous treatment system. Can treat about 1 ton a day or 265 gallons a day. As I mentioned, it uses air. It's a lot safer than pure oxygen, and it's fully computer controlled. We have acquired a lot of expertise handling slurries, and that comes in handy with treating all kinds of waste, in particular suspension of ion exchange and GAC, and I'll show you a little bit more during my presentation. So here's a flow sheet, and I'll walk you through how it works. This is the flow sheet for the pilot system that I was just showing pictures, and if we follow the feedstock or the waste, it is then pressurized, and then from here on, everything is at the supercritical pressure, something like 3,400 psi. So it is pressurized, the waste is pressurized, and then undergoes mild preheating. The temperatures that I'm showing on this diagram are just kind of example, sample pressures, sample numbers. And we're mildly preheating so that we don't bring the waste all the way to supercritical conditions to avoid charring, gasification, and corrosion as well, because most of the corrosion happens below the critical point. At this point here, we call this the injection T. This is upstream of the reactor. This is where the waste undergoing treatment is mixed with a superheated stream of air and water. And what this does, it flashes, it brings the waste undergoing treatment very quickly to supercritical conditions. So this phase transition is limited, and that really limits the corrosion, but it also makes the reactor much smaller. And then within seconds, the supercritical mass travels through the reactor, which is just a long tubular reactor. The temperature increases, and all the supercritical water oxidation reaction happens. The treated waste and then cooled through successive heat exchangers. There's a final cooling, and then phase separation. Like the permanent gases and then clean water effluent. And if we follow the other loop, there's a water loop and air that I mixed, and then go through preheating. The furnace here is really to start off the process, and because the pilot is not optimized for energy recovery, it's generally on to a reduced power during the system to compensate for heat losses. So here are the summary of the findings treating PFAS waste. We effectively eliminated all PFAS. Done a number of runs with different kinds of waste, and we routinely observed many log reductions, 3 or more. And I highlight the fact that this is a system that was not optimized for PFAS removal. The system was designed originally to treat fecal sludge and such organic wastes. So it's remarkable that we see these performance. We've treated a large range of PFAS concentrations in water, in rinsates that have 100,000 ppt all the way to diluted AFFF at 200, 300 ppm of total organic fluorine and above. Generally, what we see is that the effluent composition is representative of the influent. And what does it mean? It means that there's no transformation of high molecular weight into smaller PFAS species. We never detected any trifluoroacetic acid or perfluoropropionic acid. So we are not transforming the PFAS to volatile species. Temperature is important for reactivity. And typically we see correlation of the performance with temperature. And also, as I will show you in the next slide, we only found traces of volatile PFAS in the vent gases. So there's further evidence that we're destroying PFAS and we're not producing any volatile. And indeed, what we did is we teamed up with the EPA, and they came with their analytical devices, and I'm showing here some pictures to the right. You see SUMA canisters and sorbent tubes, and they analyzed the vent gas, the effluent, and using different techniques. And the highlights are shown there. There was no formation of HF. We control the pH in our system, and fluorine stays as fluoride in the liquid. There was no CF4. There was only traces of a few volatiles, and they're listed. Methane being one, perfluoroheptane being another one. but the concentrations and the mass flux were really low. These were traces. In particular, I'm putting this number here, 0.2%. So this is the fraction of the organofluorine that was fed to the system that was recovered or that ended up in the gas vent. And I stress here the fact that this is in a system that was not optimized for PFAS. And so, thinking into the future for a system that will have a longer reaction time and will have a further optimization for PFAS treatment, this number is likely to go further down. So I think this allows me to say with confidence, and we have the data to prove it, that SCWO does not emit significant amounts of volatile PFAS. I want to show you in the next few slides the proof that we're mineralizing the organofluorine to inorganic fluoride. And we attempted to make fluorine balances on the larger system, but it was very difficult because there's a lot of nooks and crannies where fluorine, in particular precipitated calcium fluoride, can hide. And therefore, we turn into a lab system. In the lab system, we call it the mini SCWO, is simply a high-pressure pump, a tube furnace, and the reactor in that furnace. We use an isothermal condition, and then cooling, and we can capture everything that leaves. So we have extremely good control over the what goes in and what goes out, with minimal opportunities for fluoride to hide. And we can do, of course, target analysis. Here's a picture to the right of what the system looks like. And our approach here is to make injections of selected PFAS species, generally single species, and measure the fluoride come out and compare the inputs and outputs. And we can use, and we are using this system as well for kinetic determinations to understand the kinetic of destruction of the specific PFAS. There are differences, though, between this lab system and the large-scale system, is that in this small system, we use hydrogen peroxide as oxidant, but the hydrogen peroxide with temperature gets converted to oxygen and then acts. And then there's slightly different thermal management and temperature profiles that, as we think about these, what these results mean for the larger scale, we need to be able to reconcile things such as reaction time. And so here's typical results that I'm showing. I am reporting something we call the PFOA, or PFAS mineralization. It is the ratio between the fluoride that we recovered, the mass of fluoride, divided by the mass of fluorine PFAS injected. And so when this is 100%, it means that every PFAS that was injected, every fluorine atom that was injected is recovered as fluoride. And so this experiment shown here is for 1 ppm PFOA at a constant temperature of 600 degrees. And as a function of the reaction time, we are reporting this PFOA mineralization. And what you can see, as we could expect, is that with increased reaction time, we're increasing the mineralization. And there is a point at around 35, 40 seconds where we get 100% recovery as fluoride. It's interesting, though, that the point where we don't have 100% mineralization, we also non-detect for all target PFAS that we analyze through our targeted analysis. And we analyze about 40 compounds. No TFA, no PFPRA. And what is probably happening here is that we decarboxylate PFOA, and we're producing perfluoroheptane, which is non-soluble and probably ends up in the gas phase. So under these conditions, we might be producing gas species, but just we now know that we need a certain reaction time in order to reach 100%. And we're going to confirm these through gas measurements. So we're showing here, the proof that we're completely destroying PFAS and utilizing it to fluoride. With a number of these experiments, it's a bit of a busy figure, but what we're showing here is also for different reaction times, the mineralization for different species, PFOA, which is relatively easy to mineralize, and then PFPRA at different oxidant levels. So this EX means oxidant excess to stoichiometry. The take-home message for this slide is that with greater quantities of oxidants, we have greater mineralization and faster reaction as we might expect. I'm also showing on this line, this is a rinsate, and we're showing the mineralization. So these results led us to conclude that oxidant concentration matters. There are different reactivities for the different PFAS species. So the next step in this particular experiment is expanding the list. We are including PFBS and 6-2-FTS in our targets and complete these experiments with also target analysis. And then draw a conclusion for the design of full-scale systems. I want to show you some results of the exploratory treatment of spent sorbent, because sorbents play an important role in treating, say, drinking water or low concentrations. And these were short-term exploratory runs that we did, and we treated both granular activated carbon that was spent, so it was loaded with PFAS, and different kinds of ion exchange resins. Both of these were dimethyl benzenes. They were all loaded with. And here are some of the highlights. You see some pictures. This is the slurry that was treated for GAC and for IX. In both cases, we used about a 10% mass by volume slurry. And the beauty by when we're treating IX and GAC is that the matrix, the resin or the GAC actually provides the calorific content that we need to be effective with supercritical water oxidation. So we don't have to add any co-fuel to the systems. And the results are pending, but they're consistent with high destruction of the PFAS. I want to be very clear here that we're not talking about regeneration or reactivation. SCWO fully destroys the resin or the GAC. So this is good for single use and not reactivating. So why is supercritical water oxidation so effective at destroying PFAS? Summing up here the scientific reasons for that. I mentioned earlier in my talk that supercritical water is a semi-dense or dense medium, and it's very reactive. If you look at the density of supercritical water, it's something like 350 to 1,000 times greater than the density of gas in an incinerator because of the pressure and the lower temperature. And it is this combination of temperature and pressure that really makes it more reactive. If you think about the collisions between the molecules at a greater pressure, there's going to be a lot more collisions between PFAS and water and reactive molecules. Also, the presence of water is important here. And what it does is that it makes it for very efficient generation of reactive species. Name a few here. It's, of course, very complicated, but there's hydroxyl radicals and hydroperoxy radicals. And water also influences reactions such as the hydrolysis of carbonyl fluoride, which we know is a probable species that is formed in thermal processes. And lastly, another reason is the properties of supercritical water itself. The supercritical water has very interesting properties in terms of as a solvent. Oxygen is fully soluble, and all organics are fully soluble. So we have a homogeneous phase that makes it so reactive. Those are some of the reasons why SCWO is so effective and so interesting as a technique. So what are some of the lessons that we've learned in our process, in our project? I get this question a lot. Can we reach those low levels, current advisories or future MCLs? We have a lot of runs. We have a lot of data showing that we can reach the single digits, a lot of data showing non-detect. And so we're very confident in the ability to achieve multiple log reductions. Also, SCWO is a kinetic process, and what that means is that we know how to tailor the log reductions by changing the reaction time and the temperature, just as I was showing earlier on some of the experiments that we did at the bench scale. So we know that we can tailor the conditions to a particular treatment endpoint. Putting the last point, the bullet point here, some folks have suggested that we could do multiple passes. You know, if you want to have 7 log reductions, once you pass your waste twice through the system. But I think it's an expensive proposal, and in my opinion, a longer reaction time through a longer reactor is a better. There's special considerations that are needed when you try to do 5 log reductions or more. I'm showing here an example why that is special attention is needed. If you take an extreme case of 1 drop of AFFF, 0.1 mil, it has a very high concentration of PFAS, 7,000 ppm. So if you have 1 drop that went through untreated, or that has some short circuiting, it has the potential to contaminate 10,000 liters, so 10 cubic meters at the 70 ppt level. And so again, special considerations for making sure that there's good treatment, that everything going through the reactor gets treated, that there's no short circuiting, but there's also that there's nothing that is going through the system untreated, because a little bit of contamination can go a long way. Energy balances. Energy is a big consideration for going to scale. And I'm showing here numbers for the projections that are done together with 374 Water. And it is considering different models for going to scale. 6 tons a day, or 6 cubic meters a day, or you can see here in non-metrics, it's about 1,600 gallons a day. Or if we think about in terms of capacity for sorbents, about roughly 1 ton. And it depends on the sorbent, it depends on the condition. For a system that can treat 6 tons a day, it would be 1 40-foot container. And that system would consume a little bit of power, about 10 kilowatts to 240 kilowatt hour a day. If you scale up, you benefit from the economies of scale, and there's better access to energy recovery systems. The energy balance looks like this. Actually produce power, not a lot, but something like 300 kilowatt hour a day. And then for much larger system, 200 tons a day, this would probably not, this would be a bespoke system, not a containerized system. Kilowatt hour a day. A couple slides on the economic analysis. Here I'm showing some estimated cost for rinse aids. So similar, this is for waste that doesn't have much organic, so it needs to be having fuel added. And I'm showing it for both the SCWO 6 and the 30. So 6 tons or 30 wet tons a day. And you can see rough estimated price for the purchase. And depending on the assumptions that you're making, you might be amortizing this in different ways. Operating cost here separated, including the fuel cost as well as the manpower and maintenance and so other. When you put it all together, at the 6 ton a day, it comes to about 77 cents per gallon. And the larger scale is, the fuel costs are significant here. So if you have another waste, a co-waste that can be used to be added, it will yield some savings. Or if you can concentrate the waste and treat a smaller volume. These are estimated costs for sorbents. The benefit here is that you don't need to add a fuel, of course, based on the capacity, and the estimated costs are about 40 cents or this assumes 8,000 hours of operation a year, and the assumption are shown there. If we were able to treat it at a greater concentration, it would have. So, putting it all together, what does it mean for you? What are the benefits to DoD? These are my conclusions. So, SCWO is a destructive treatment. We've shown that we can treat and mineralize all PFAS to fluoride, and this works for all PFAS as precursors and co-contaminants as well. It's a kinetic process. We know how to design it for desired endpoint. And we can account for the fluoride. It's something that on a steady state, we can account for the fluoride and we can report and document destruction. A SCWO is compact, it's a very small system, and it is scalable. And that's in the reason why it's compact is such a fast process. And we know how to handle slurries. And so we can destroy solids directly. And then I mentioned 374 water a few times during my talk. We're actively using 374 as a vehicle for tech transfer. They're actively promoting and running transfer and talking to the Department of Defense for demonstration. So this is my contact information. Thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to.
Great. Thank you, Mark. To our audience, at this time, please submit any additional questions that you have using the Q&A box that's on your screen. Mark, we do have a number of questions. The first is from the Army National Guard. Can you discuss where in the process that solids are removed? And if you'd like to go back to the process flow diagram in your presentation, feel free to do that, Mark.
Could you repeat the question, where in the process? And I didn't hear the end of the question.
That solids are removed.
Yes. Oh, can you go to slide 26, please? Yes, this one. Thank you. So where the solids are, where are the solids removed? And this is the pilot that we have at Duke. Commercial systems will be slightly different. But in this particular process, all the effluent comes as one phase. It is cooled down. We're not supercritical here anymore. And here we set in this first separator, we're separating the permanent gases from the liquid slurry that has some of the minerals suspended. It actually, there's some sieves that retain the larger solids, and then everything is depressurized through capillaries. Here is a what you end up with in the effluent is a suspension. You can just filter that or centrifuge or just use gravity separation. In commercial systems, the effluent and separation is slightly different. They're different streams, but I don't have a slide that shows it.
Okay, thank you. Next, given the very high pressure and high temperature, are there safety concerns with this process?
Yeah, this is a great question that I get a lot. And so as we started with this project at Duke, there was a lot of concerns about, this is that going to be very dangerous? And so we have very strict protocols, safety protocols in place. And I'm very proud to say that we have 0 incidents with our systems in 1,000 hours of operation, more than 100 runs. And it is an industrial process, and it is indeed high pressure and high temperature, but it is only slightly higher than the temperature and pressure that you get in a diesel engine. People put their heads under the hood of a diesel engine every day, and it's not every day that you see a diesel engine go and the other couple other factors here. There are safety features in the system. Pressure release valves, rupture discs, and another factor that reduces the risk is the fact that the volume is so small. The volume of the reactor in this particular pilot is less than 1 liter. So the actual energy embedded is relatively low. And all of this contributes to a relatively safe process. Some people have heard of an explosion of a supercritical water oxidation system in Orlando, but that system was operating with pure oxygen. And there was an oxygen leak in a dusty environment, and this led to an explosion. And it's one of the reasons why we are using air.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. Thanks, Mark. Next, can you talk about whether this system can treat actual AFFF and what the range of those materials might be? Like, could it treat the concentrated AFFF or the rinsate or anything else?
Yes, So the highest concentration of AFFF that we've treated is a 30-fold diluted. Some of these results have been published by Krause from the EPA. Those tests were done in collaboration with the there are limitations of treating directly AFFF because AFFF contains a lot of surfactants, so it's actually a supercharged fuel. And our current system was actually engineered to run on fumes and not on a supercharged fuel. So we would have to dilute it. I think we would have to dilute it maybe about tenfold before we can treat it in the projected system. But the challenges of treating AFFF would be pH control and salt control, but inherently there are no limitations to treating AFFF directly. And the fact that it has a high concentration of surfactant is a good thing because it serves as the fuel that I mentioned in the high calorific content.
And there's another question related to that about salt control. Is there a concern about salting out? And if so, how is that dealt with?
Yeah, so there's definitely historical records of salt deposition and plugging of reactors in supercritical water oxidation. And it was a concern when we started the design of the system originally with the project. And this is why we decided to use air, because it actually provides a lot of velocity in the reactor to move the salt. It also, and the reactor configuration is such that we avoid salt deposition. There is an upper limit to salt concentration that we think is maybe around 5% of halide in the feed. That is the upper limit. Because if there's too much salt, ultimately what will happen in supercritical condition is that some salts will precipitate, and it's a mechanical challenge to move it through the system.
That makes sense. Thank you. Do you know if this is an EPA approved process for PFAS treatment? Is EPA approval needed for use of this, for example, at a Superfund site? And if not, what is the time frame for getting that kind of approval?
I think that's a question for EPA folks. I do not know. I think that the tests that were done together with the EPA were very successful, and I think they reported in publications very good results. But I don't know how they label supercritical water oxidation. I don't have any indication of the timeline for.
Okay. And has this system been used, or could it be used for treatment of soil?
So soil presents some unique challenges because of grit and sand, and it's really not an issue that has anything to do with the treatment itself. But it's the fact that we need to be able to pump slurries at a high pressure. And currently, with our positive displacement pumps, we cannot treat soil, unfortunately. I do have some ideas about how we might be able to do, but currently, with the systems that I showed, and we cannot treat soil.
Okay. And what about just two more questions, I think. So first, what about the fate of metals? Are metals, that are in the influent, for example, are the metals conserved throughout the process, or could their oxidation states be changed?
Yeah, great question. Metals are metals, and it will remain metals. And so metals in are going to be equal metal out. They will mostly form as metal oxides, and the majority will end up in any salts that will, in precipitated salts that come out. Specifics will depend on the waste that is treated, the pH in the system, and specific conditions.
Okay. And one last question, which I think is on many people's minds, and this is from the Department of the Air Force. Based on these findings, Can this process serve as a feasible alternative to incineration of PFAS?
Oh, I would say definitely yes. Yeah, and I think it's a very promising.
Okay, wonderful. Well, Mark, thank you so much for the presentation and answering questions. We will bring Mark back on the line at the end of the webinar for some additional questions.
Thank you very much.
Thanks. Now, at this time, it's my pleasure to introduce the speaker for today's second technical presentation. Dr. Joel Tickner is a professor of environmental health at the University of Massachusetts Lowell, and there he has worked to build interdisciplinary bridges for the design and application of sustainable chemicals and materials. Joel is also the founding executive director of the Association for the Advancement of Alternatives Assessment, which is a professional association dedicated to advancing the science, practice, and policy of alternatives assessment and informed substitution. He earned his bachelor's degree from Colby College and his master's in environmental studies from the University of Montana. And his doctoral degree was in work environment, cleaner production, and pollution, and it was from the University of Massachusetts Lowell. Joel, please proceed with your presentation.
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me here today. Let me start by saying my presentation will be less technical than Mark's, but I think as important. Obviously, the technology that Mark describes is about fixing a problem that's already there. Our work is really about how to avoid those problems in the first place. I'm trained as a health scientist, and much of my career has been studying the health effects of problem chemicals. And studying those health effects doesn't necessarily lead to solutions that drive better, safer, more sustainable chemistries that are high performing and cost effective. I want to also thank my colleague, our applied research director, Molly Jacobs, for her help with this presentation and guiding our project, as well as our postdoc, Dr. Monica Roy, and our colleagues, Liz Harriman and Pamela Ison from the Toxics Use Reduction Institute. And a very important shout out to Dr. Robin Nissen for his leadership on the SERDP and ESTCP program, particularly the vision around ensuring that the next generation of firefighting foams or solution solvents or other chemistries are safe and do not result in the problems that Mark's technology is trying to clean up. So let me give you an outline of the presentation. What I'm going to do first is introduce the concept of alternatives assessment, talk about the goals of our project, and then dig into how we applied the methodologies and the thinking on alternatives assessment to AFFF, both looking at alternatives assessment, but looking at core components of an alternatives assessment, finding a safer chemical or how we evaluate safer chemicals. And then also the performance question, which is a key issue for DoD of having mission critical, high performing and cost effective chemistries. And then lastly, really thinking about those adoption needs. Finding a safer alternative is great, but if it can't be adopted in practice, that leads to another set of challenges. So let me first introduce the concept of alternatives assessment. Alternatives assessment is a process for identifying, comparing, and selecting safer alternatives to chemicals of concern. It's not a new process. Similar to risk assessment, it evaluates chemicals, but instead of identifying a safe level of exposure or a risk level, it really starts with understanding that we have a chemical of concern and what are the safer alternatives that meet a functional need. So it's really used for what's called, the EPA has called informed substitution, which is the considered transition from a chemical of higher concern to a chemical or technology of lower concern, using the best available information that can either be created or modeled. So what we're trying to do is look at various aspects of those alternatives, from hazards to comparative exposure potential to life cycle, cost, and performance. And the goal here is really about facilitating the informed discussion of pros and cons of alternatives and informing that selection and adoption phase. So what we're trying to do is avoid regrettable substitutions when we make a decision, for example, in the NDAA to prohibit fluorinated firefighting foams. We want to make sure that the alternatives that come in place do not cause a new set of problems. And we've seen that time and time again where we make a decision to phase out a chemistry and we don't think about what the alternatives are that are coming in and then have to create or address the new problems as they come in. So these are the key components of an alternatives assessment at a glance. The National Research Council published a guidance on alternatives assessment in 2014 that lays out a much comprehensive approach similar to the Academy's 1983 Red Book on risk assessment. But the key components are really starting with the scoping, right? Asking those questions. Is the function needed? Are there other alternatives? What are our design criteria or our decision rules for thinking about alternatives? That hazard and comparative exposure assessment, because we really want to understand a wide range of human health and ecological hazards, but also those trade-offs of exposure. Sometimes an alternative may either change the exposure profile from a concern from air to water. It may increase exposure. So we want to understand what those trade-offs are. Technical feasibility assessment, evaluating the performance against the needs established during the problem formulation phase, understanding the economic feasibility, but over the life cycle of a chemical product. And then other life cycle considerations upstream or downstream. And then lastly, and often not thought about, is the decision-making phase. So once we identify and compare those various trade-offs, how do we make a decision about acceptable alternatives? And then how do we implement those? And when we don't have better alternatives, how do we drive research and development to design better alternatives? And I think the SERDP program has done a great job identifying research need for early stage new innovative alternatives for AFFF. So our overall arching project goals were really to accelerate the identification and adoption of alternatives that are safer for AFFF and PFAS products, to minimize regrettable substitutes. And really what we wanted to understand is, have alternatives assessments been done to date on AFFF? What have they said? How do we make better decisions regarding what are safer alternatives and what is sufficient performance? And then really understanding what's needed to support the adoption of safer alternatives. Ultimately, this project is really about creating the approaches and the knowledge and the methodologies to address other chemicals of concern for DoD and other agencies. So first off, our first part of our project was to understand the landscape of existing alternatives assessments to AFFF. What we did was we sought to review existing assessments in order to understand their strengths and weaknesses to support improvements and future efforts ongoing. There have been a number of assessments on AFFF alternatives, from work on performance to hazard evaluation. However, we established criteria for what type of assessment could be considered a comprehensive alternatives assessment for this work. Evaluations of alternatives were required to meet 4 criteria to be considered a comprehensive alternatives assessment and included in our review. They had to evaluate commercially available alternatives. They had to evaluate hazard, cost, and performance attributes. And if they did, exposure and life cycle, but those were optional. They had to use a standardized assessment criteria to systematically evaluate and compare alternatives to the incumbent, which is AFFF. And they had to include PFAS-free or fluorine-free alternatives and the incumbent product to support a comparative evaluation. And those alternatives were evaluated against 2 seminal alternatives assessment frameworks: the 2014 U.S. National Research Council Framework to Guide the Selection of Chemical Alternatives, and the Interstate Chemicals Clearinghouse Alternatives Assessment Guide. The Interstate Chemicals Clearinghouse is a network of state agencies and other stakeholders to coordinate chemicals management activities at the state and local level in the United States. Oops. So what we did was we looked through that literature and we identified that there was only one alternatives assessment that met all 4 of our inclusion criteria and was included in this critical review. It was an alternatives assessment undertaken by Wood to support the regulatory risk management options by the European Chemicals Agency. And although the data in this alternatives assessment was limited to information that third-party researchers were able to collect, which was highly dependent on voluntary compliance by industrial parties, the assessment was generally aligned with the approaches for alternatives assessment outlined by the NRC and IC2 frameworks. We did identify several areas for improvements for future alternatives assessments on AFFF. Among them include a need to broaden the scope to not limit function to film-forming foams. So in this alternatives assessment, only film-forming foams were considered. That may preclude different alternative processes or technologies that have the capacity to extinguish fires in a number of different scenarios, but do so by different methods other than the use of chemical surfactants or wetting agents. The need to examine a broader set of hazard endpoints using measured and modeled data rather than solely safety data sheets. Safety data sheets often have limited data across hazard endpoints. So really trying to increase that number of endpoints to consider, including modeled and other actual toxicological data to support gaps in knowledge. And then ultimately, there's a need to augment the European Chemical Agency's assessment because of the rapid development of non-PFAS alternatives that's being driven by the NDAA state laws in the US and the European restrictions. So it's a very dynamic landscape for alternatives assessments. And these have opened the door to an abundance of alternatives. And we want to make sure that those are considered in future alternatives assessments. Some of those have been created by the Greenstream certified standard for firefighting foam, as well as performance evaluations conducted under the SERDP and ESTCP program. So the next part of our project was to evaluate what makes a safer alternative. There are several definitions, and often the lack of a definition of safer is a barrier to the transition to safer chemicals. So how do we think about what is a safer alternative? Currently, in the MIL spec, it only includes aquatic toxicity, a limited specter of aquatic toxicity and persistence. So we wanted to develop specific criteria to evaluate and determine whether alternatives are safer as compared to current PFAS-containing AFFF products. Those decisions about whether a chemical is sufficiently safe for a particular use are often made through quantitative risk assessments, which can be resource intensive and require a significant amount of exposure data. These generally answer the question of whether an exposure level is sufficiently safe or acceptable, but they don't answer the question about whether a chemistry is intrinsically less hazardous or safer. So in alternatives assessment, we focus on comparing hazards, intrinsic exposure potential, performance, and cost to identify options that are safer and more feasible than the incumbent, with the overall goal of facilitating the informed transition to safer alternatives and minimizing the potential for regrettable substitutes. When it comes to evaluating whether an alternative is safer than the incumbent, assessors use hazard criteria and metrics related to exposure potential and as hazard. No alternative is likely to be beyond benign. Safer rarely implies safe. A robust inventory of safe and sustainable chemistries and technologies that are benign to human health is currently unavailable for the vast majority of chemical functions and applications currently being served by chemicals of concern. As such, the best course of action is to use less hazardous or safer substances while we speed up efforts to develop and apply those safer and sustainable chemistry innovations. But what is safe enough? Alternatives assessment methods stop short of dictating specific decision-making criteria about whether an alternative is safer than the incumbent chemical or product. Traditionally, decisions are left in the hands of those seeking to find safer substitutes or design new products. Over the last 3 years, there have been a handful of efforts to establish decision criteria about what is safe enough or what is safer. And these include the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, their framework for defining a safer chemical, EPA's Safer Choice Program, which defines criteria for safer alternatives for specific functions and applications of chemicals, The Washington Department of Ecology is part of their Safer Products for Washington regulatory actions, and the Green Screen Certified, which define a safer AFFF alternative that would meet their certification criteria. So our focus really here is on establishing minimum criteria for safer alternatives. So we use both the OECD's minimum requirements and the Green Screen Certified and said, well, those are the baseline. And ideally, we would go beyond that minimum set of criteria to have an increasingly comprehensive data set to make more informed decisions about those alternatives. So more data often indicates an increasing in confidence in the safety of a chemical. So those minimum requirements need to be seen as the baseline in a broader hierarchy of criterion assessment practices that ultimately should be providing stakeholders with the confidence that a specific alternative is indeed safer. It doesn't provide ultimate confidence because data, scientific data is always evolving, but we use the best available data that can be modeled or created to solve that problem. So criteria for safer alternatives. This is how we developed the minimum requirements for AFFF alternative determination. There's two parts to these requirements. Part A focuses on ensuring that potentially problematic classes of substances are not ingredients intentionally added or impurities or residuals in a safer alternative formulation. A safer AFFF alternative cannot include fluorine, still the best metric for understanding that a formula is PFAS-free. The volatile cyclic siloxanes D4, 5, and 6, these are known toxic chemicals recently classified as substances of very high concern in the EU under the REACH regulation, and alkylphenol and alkylphenol ethoxylates. These widely used surfactants are considered environmentally persistent, can range from toxic to extremely toxic to aquatic organisms, and can exert endocrine disruption effects. Part B focuses on specific hazard endpoints and expand on the OECD's guidance minimum criteria for safer. An AFFF alternative should not be considered safer if it is classified as high concern for any of the endpoints listed in this table. And those include carcinogenicity, mutagenicity, reproductive developmental toxicity. A few endpoints such as chronic or acute and chronic aquatic toxicity are not addressed in the OECD guidance. But because aquatic toxicity is so critical given how these firefighting agents are used and should be presumed that foams will be released into water bodies. This next slide talks about what constitutes a chemical of high concern. So here's, you can see this is for one endpoint, reproductive or developmental toxicity. A categorization of high concern is based on the use of authoritative lists. These are developed by government agencies or authoritative scientific bodies to screen out unacceptable substances based on demonstrated scientific concern for human health and the environment. This is an easy place to start for most people. If it's on the list, we should be avoiding it. Secondly, GHS criteria, the globally harmonized system for classification and labeling of chemicals, provides internationally standardized criteria for classifying substances and mixtures according to their human health, physical, and environmental hazards. Applying GHS criteria for a specific hazard endpoint allows assessors to review current scientific evidence and categorize an alternative as low, moderate, or high concern for a given hazard. Those considered high concern among the minimum requirements should be removed from further consideration. So as you can see, in the case of developmental or reproductive toxicology, no ingredient in the formulation should be considered a GHS 1A or 1B reproductive toxicant to be considered safer. Moving beyond the minimum is also important. So this is where we might take the minimum criteria, but we would really want to know much more, particularly in the case of AFFF alternatives, wherever possible. So the guidance outlines additional hazard endpoints to consider beyond the minimum. Of particular importance is the inclusion of mobility, which is being developed as a criteria for chemicals in the EU. Mobility is critical for chemicals that end up in water and is particularly of concern for AFFF and PFAS chemistries. The other would be endocrine disruption and skin and respiratory sensitization. So let's jump to the next part of our project. In this one, we started looking at performance, because performance and lack of adequate performance is also often used as a reason for not switching towards safer alternatives. But it's also critical for agencies like the Department of Defense to ensure that decisions are made that ensure mission critical supplies of high performing alternatives. However, performance can be a barrier if evaluations are based around a single best-in-class performance metric, require performance through specific mechanisms, or require consideration of adoption feasibility as part of the performance evaluation. Performance and feasibility are very different things. Whether an alternative can put out a fire is different than whether it can be applied in the current firefighting equipment. So what we did was we developed out a new concept called fit for purpose for performance, which is a strategy for assessing performance based on application-specific contexts, with the goal of minimizing extended debates over whether alternatives perform equally to the incumbent chemistry. The goal here is sufficient performance for a particular application. So it builds on this and broadens existing approaches for evaluating alternatives. This approach underscores the importance of evaluating whether the function of the chemical, material, or product or process of concern achieves sufficient performance for the application. And it expands the thinking around performance as a range and acknowledges important considerations around trade-offs with environment, health, and safety, where environment, health, and safety are considered a performance criteria equal to whether that chemical actually puts out a fire or whether it's cost effective. And this is hopefully can inform companies and governments to support product design, policy, and procurement decisions. So the overall goals here of a fit for performance assessment are select safer products, fulfill performance needs across a range of applications, minimize extended debates over performance, and expand the thinking and frameworks around what alternative solutions could be considered acceptable. We developed 6 guiding considerations in our performance fit for purpose performance assessment framework. The first is to determine the function of the chemical of concern for the particular application. So the first issue is understanding what is the function of the chemical. Is that function even needed? And this is the concept that's been brought up as part of PFAS regulation in the EU around what's called essential uses. Is that function needed? In some applications, it may not be needed. For example, water repellency. In others, it is needed. But really understanding that function to then understand alternatives is critical. Secondly is defining application-specific use scenarios. So understanding what are the applications of firefighting foams, what are the specific applications, and what are the performance needs for those various applications. Then to develop those performance standards independent of the standards that are dependent on using a chemical of concern. So many of the performance standards were actually developed based on the actual chemical of concern. So if we develop a performance standard, for example, based on hexavalent chromium, nothing will ever work as well as hexavalent chromium. So standards need to be based on the performance needs rather than a specific chemistry. So we need to adjust those performance needs based on the available alternatives or those alternatives on the horizon. And then really understanding the range of standard or performance standard benchmarks. So we want to understand, is the performance of a particular alternative inadequate? Is it sufficient, or is it best in class? Because performance is always a range. Sometimes alternatives really don't perform as well. They don't put out a fire as fast, or they allow burn back. Sometimes they do just well enough, but not as good as AFFF. And rarely anything is going to do quite as good as AFFF. And then best in class is, in a particular application, is these are the best ones you can have. We want to consider technical performance separately from technical feasibility. So we want to understand and not discount alternatives simply because we don't want to switch our distribution equipment at this point. But maybe in 10 years when that equipment ages and we're replacing it, we can think about something that's totally outside the box that puts out fires by a new mechanism. So we should think about those separately. Obviously, technical feasibility will come into play. Is it adoptable in the existing machinery? Do we need to make significant changes? And then lastly, we want to consult stakeholders more broadly in understanding what are acceptable trade-offs between performance and health and safety. So really understanding, putting on the table, what are those trade-offs and how do we address those more effectively? Are there small changes to the performance that would address those health and safety concerns, or design changes, or mechanical changes, process considerations that could change? So the last part of this, our project, was really looking at the substitution process. In the end, it's all about whether those alternatives can be adopted. And what we found from many of our efforts over the last 20 years, looking, for example, at alternatives to phthalate plasticizers, or looking at alternatives to chlorinated solvents, that implementation matters. If we can figure out how to implement those alternatives, for example, in Massachusetts, we reduced the use of trichloroethylene by 95% in degreasing operations, really by focusing on the viability and the feasibility of alternatives for small and medium-sized companies, evaluating those. So in the end, if we can make it work, adoption is really critical. You might have a better alternative, but if it can't be adopted, well, it's not a good alternative. So if alternatives are available, there's a set of challenges. One, are they produced in sufficient quantities? Two, what are the investments in changes in equipment and training? Three, are there new regulatory approvals to get those alternatives across the finish line? And then fourth, are there customer approvals or certifications needed? And lastly, what do we have to change in the way we manage those chemicals from a health and safety perspective? So let's look at some of those challenges. What we did was a series of interviews with experts in the field to understand what were the key challenges, including performance bodies. What are the key challenges or inhibitory factors to the transition? And what are the most important enablers to the transition to safer alternatives to AFFF? In the end, we did the interviews, both domestically and internationally, with stakeholders involving fire suppression experts, procurement experts, defense agency experts, alternative product developers, fire marshals, emergency management agencies, and state environmental departments and airport firefighting personnel. We did a review of the literature, including peer-reviewed publications, reports in the gray literature, and then we delved deeper into some of the topics that have emerged in the interviews and in discussions during SERDP and ESTCP meetings. So we identified 5 key inhibitory factors that are serving as barriers to an effective transition, and those include transition costs. Although the purchase price of F3 alternatives is cost competitive, replacement costs related to equipment, contamination and disposal costs, and may be significant, as well as training. There's a lack of knowledge of performance for specific real-world scenarios, so proof of concept or demonstration level performance tests of F3 alternatives are simply not enough to give assurances to some users that the alternatives will work as needed in actual firefighting circumstances. Substitution regret. Some users are unwilling or unable to transition to F3 alternatives because of the lack of certifications or approvals needed. There are also lingering questions about the health and safety of alternatives for both workers and the environment that need to be addressed. And then standards, performance standards and specifications. For example, the US DoD performance standard, the MIL spec 2435F in the US, are hindering adoption of alternatives. In addition, there's an array of alternatives that standards related to the use of firefighting foams, and often those conflict with each other. And then lastly, the lack of a national and coordinated transition strategy. The enabling factors are really important, though. just do it. So using exercises, mock exercises to understand the performance of alternatives, financial liabilities associated with the continued use of AFFF, the use of more fit for purpose performance standards, and then obviously one of the most important ones is policy mandates. Yep. So we found that there are a number of key drivers for effective substitution programs. One is developing collaborative performance testing and demonstration sites. Much of this is the work of the SERDP and ESTCP program. Issuing a comprehensive and collaborative implementation strategy, and establishing a national movement towards safer alternatives, really having a very clear transition strategy to safer alternatives, ensuring adequate education and training on those alternatives, and then having systems for ongoing monitoring to minimize regrettable substitutions and to make sure that those alternatives are actually working in practice. So let me end with conclusions. What we found was that evaluation of PFAS-free AFFF products will benefit from a comprehensive alternatives assessment approach to evaluate trade-offs against multiple attributes. That those minimum requirements for safer alternatives need to align with regulatory priorities in the US, EU, Canada, and other jurisdictions to support safer and feasible substitution. That fit for purpose metrics show the importance of evaluating function against specific use scenarios. So expecting that one alternative will meet every application like AFFF is probably an unrealistic expectation, that we need fit for purpose options. And then a range of factors are needed to ensure effective substitution, including a coordinated national strategy, training support, and systems for ongoing monitoring. The benefits of our work for DoD are really to show how the alternatives assessment approach can support informed substitution and accelerate the transition to safer alternatives while avoiding regrettable substitutions. That we can elevate aligned criteria and clear criteria across chemical types to support decisions about what is a safer alternative. And that needs to be clear to the marketplace and to the regulatory community. It is our project challenges DoD to consider use of fit for purpose performance standards for appropriate applications, and it really elevates the needs to focus on adoption and ensure that those challenges and needs are addressed as we transition to safer alternatives. And I'll stop there, and our 4 reports from this project are located on the SERDP ESTCP website. So thank you very much for inviting me today.
Thank you, Joel. At this time, to the audience, you can type in questions for Joel using the Q&A box. The first question is about slide 54. If you could navigate back to slide 54.
Yep.
And the question is from Navair and is about how the leading PFAS-free alternative foams stack up against these criteria. Can you summarize that on a broad level? If some
Yeah, I believe some of them have been, at least 2 or 3 of them, and my colleague Molly Jacobs may be able to put a comment in the chat or the Q&A about this. Several of them met the criteria for the green screen certified, so they are meeting these criteria. Not all of them do. Not all of them have been assessed against all of these criteria. So there are at least some that do meet these criteria. That is my understanding.
Okay, good to know.
Our understanding is that, you know, the Jerry Bach and group have looked at about 5 of these, and Navair is looking at them, so the same one. So there's about 5 that seem to have excellent performance that are approximating AFFF performance, and of those, I believe 3 of them are green screen certified.
Next, can you talk about to what extent DoD is using fit for purpose guidance, or alternatively, how could DoD implement fit for purpose performance assessment in practice?
Yeah, I mean, I believe in some applications, DoD is starting to think about this, but it's a new way of thinking about chemical alternatives. Typically it's been looking at a single standard, and it may be useful to think about different standards depending on the application. So in one application, a set of alternatives may be sufficient. In other applications, it may not be sufficient. I believe there are examples of different specs that in specific chemical applications or product types that DoD has developed differing specs depending on the application, and it's really taking this to a greater degree. And we can see this in other challenging areas, really moving away from specific chemicals to more of a broad range of performance, and maybe Dr. Nissen can weigh in the Q&A at some point on that.
Okay, great. Joel, can you tell us the most critical additional work that is needed to support decision-making, specifically for the transition to safer alternatives for AFFF?
Yeah, I think, and this is the next phase of our project we're looking at, which is doing a comprehensive alternatives assessment. This is for chemistries and applications that are of national, importance or international importance. We want to make sure we get as close to right on those alternatives as possible. So a comprehensive alternatives assessment really would set the stage for ensuring that we are considering those trade-offs as effectively as possible, and are open about what those trade-offs are. So taking a broader look at the chemical, the hazard criteria, really looking at a range of performance measures, and then looking a bit more at those life cycle attributes and then finally at in the end the adoption phase. So I think what we found from our barriers and enablers research was that having a national transition strategy that is really focused on a short, medium, and long term, where the short term is looking at, because the timelines are relatively short, chemical development takes 5 to 10 years. Well, given the timelines in the NDA, there's not that kind of new development to certification to scale time. So we might think about a short term, which is ensuring that the current range of alternatives are looked at in as comprehensive a way as possible using a thorough alternatives assessment, but really thinking about what the future brings in 10 years and ensuring that the standards, the specs are written in a way that would allow for next generation alternatives to be developed that are safer, effective, and maybe work in very different ways to extinguish fires.
Wonderful. Thank you, Joel. At this time, we'd like to bring Mark back on the line. Mark, we have one more question for you. This is from the North Carolina Department of Environmental Quality, but we received a couple of questions along these lines. And it has to do with whether the SCWO equipment and services can be made mobile so that they could be used for small periods of time.
Yes, this is a great question. Currently, we think of our systems as being transportable in the sense that, if you move them every few weeks or a couple of months, it's very conceivable. As far as making one on the back of a pickup truck or in a school bus, it's not. We're not yet there, but it's possible. But it's an industrial piece of equipment, so it needs air compressor. It needs a number of things. So it's not yet nimble to the point that we can move every day. But we might get there in a not too distant future, because I think there's a lot of potential for places that want to have their PFAS destroyed in place and would come in with a system and treat a few 100 gallons and then move to the next system. That's, I think it's very conceivable.
Okay, great. Thank you, Mark. Joel, in terms of linking the two presentations today together, could you let us know to what extent alternatives assessment can consider the very end state considerations for disposal and destruction of waste, like what Mark's presentation addressing?
Sure. I think we could think about it, again, it's a chemical reaction or chemical process. So you would use the alternatives assessment process to understand the trade-offs and those options to achieve a specific function, which is destroy AFFF. So are there safer alternatives? Are there byproducts created? What are the potential exposures that might happen? This is really important as we start thinking, as Mark said, this could obviate the need for incineration, which we know creates a set of byproducts and challenges. And many of the communities that are impacted by PFAS are minority and low-income communities. So creating a new set of hazards in those communities is the last thing we want to do in solving a one problem. So you could apply alternatives assessment processes the same way to cleaning up as you would to designing or choosing a new alternative. So I think either way, it's important to make sure that we're, alternatives assessment is more of an approach, right? We don't go in there saying we've got this solution and it's the only solution. So really, anytime we're looking at, this is inherent in the National Environmental Protection or Policy Act, as part of an environmental impact assessment, you would do an alternatives assessment, including a no action alternative, to make sure that you are not creating new problems when you try to solve one problem, or if you're undertaking a new activity that you wouldn't, that you're doing the least impactful way to do what you're trying to do.
Great, understood. Thank you, Joel. And to both of our speakers, we'll leave you the opportunity to provide one last message to the audience today. What's the final message that you would like to leave them with? Mark, we'll start with you.
Sure, yeah, no, I think we're very excited about supercritical water oxidation because what I see it is really transformative. It's a different way to tackle this problem. And I think in terms of the performance, it's showing that it's able to address PFAS in a number of matrices. So I'm very excited about the future.
Great. And what I would say is, as we're thinking about transitioning to safer alternatives and really driving that transition to solve problems of the past, making sure we do that in a thoughtful way, employing alternatives, the tools of alternatives assessment, which can also be applied to the tools of chemical design, is really to ensure we're transitioning in the right direction. And I'm thrilled about Mark's technology because part of sustainable chemistry is really cleaning up the legacy of the past. So having the greenest, safest ways to clean up the legacy of the past will be critical for the future. One last thing I wanted to say is an acknowledgement for another partner I forgot to acknowledge earlier, Melissa Lavoie from the NUMOA, which was a partner on our project as well.
All right. Well, thank you both Mark and Joel for the excellent presentations today and answering the questions. All right, our next seminar in this series will be on Thursday, September 22nd, and it is part 2 of this topic. It will feature DoD-funded research on efforts to remediate sites impacted by PFAS and to identify AFFF alternatives. And the specifics of the 2 presentations that will be included in this next webinar are on the SERDP and ESTCP website. Registration is open, so please visit that website to register for this webinar and other future webinars. And before we conclude, I'd like to remind you that both the audio and a copy of the presentation of today's session will be archived on the SERDP and ESTCP webinar webpage in case you would like to refer to them in the future. And we would appreciate it if you could please take a moment to complete the survey that will pop up on your screen at this time. This concludes today's webcast. Thank you.